My son-in-law called me Deadweight at Easter dinner. He said it casually. The way people say things they've rehearsed in their heads so many times that they forget those words still have weight in the real world. He said it in front of my daughter. He said it in front of my 2 grandchildren, who were 8 and 11 years old and old enough to understand every syllable. And he said it while eating a meal that my daughter had cooked in a kitchen that I had helped them afford. I didn't say a word. I picked up my fork, cut a piece of ham, and let the comments sit in the air between us like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to name. But I knew something that day that he didn't. I knew exactly who he was, where he had come from, how he had gotten everything he had. And I knew that the man he had just called Deadweight was the reason he could afford to say it from a house that nice, at a table that full, wearing a watch that expensive. He just didn't know it yet. My name is Harold Beaumont. I spent 31 years teaching English literature to teenagers in a public high school in Central Ohio. I never made a lot of money. I never drove a new car. I lived in the same house for 27 years. I raised my daughter, Claire, mostly on my own, after her mother passed when Claire was 14. And I did it on a teacher's salary, which meant I learned very early in life that money was something you treated with respect, not something you spent to impress people, and not something you used as a weapon. Claire grew up kind and hardworking. She got a scholarship to Ohio State, studied nursing, and built herself a good life. I was proud of her every single day. I still am. The choices she made and the woman she became had nothing to do with me and everything to do with her. I just tried not to get in the way. She met Marcus when she was 26. He was in his 2nd year of medical school. Charming and ambitious, and absolutely certain of himself in a way I had always found slightly exhausting in young men. Though I tried not to hold it against him, he loved my daughter. I was sure of that, at least in the beginning, and she loved him. So I kept my opinions to myself, and I did what any good father does. I showed up when I was asked and stayed out of the way when I wasn't. Marcus finished medical school and did his residency in cardiothoracic surgery. It took 7 years of grinding, grueling work. And I watched my daughter hold their household together through every sleepless call night, every missed birthday, every moment when he was too exhausted to be a husband or a friend. Claire never complained. She just kept going. That's who she is. By the time Marcus had his own practice, they had 2 kids, a house in a good suburb, and a life that looked exactly the way a life is supposed to look from the outside. From the inside, things had started to change. The first time Marcus made a comment about me that bothered me. Claire was pregnant with their 2nd child. He made a joke at a family dinner, something about how retired teachers must have a lot of free time on their hands. I laughed it off. It was a bad joke, not a declaration of war. I'm not a man who looks for reasons to take offense, but it didn't stop there. Over the next 2 years, the comments became more frequent, more pointed. He started referring to my visits as intrusions when he thought I couldn't hear. He told Claire, at least twice that I know of, that I needed to find my own life instead of relying on theirs for social contact. He made a comment about my car, a 2009 Ford Focus that ran perfectly fine in front of the kids. He once said, within earshot of my grandson, that having me come over was like having another child to take care of. Claire always smoothed things over. She was good at that. Too good. Maybe she would redirect the conversation, make a joke, to find a way to fill the silence before it became something that required a response. Il était, because I didn't want to be the reason my daughter had conflict in her home. But I noticed everything. And there was something Marcus didn't know about me that I had never told him. Something I had never told Claire. Either. Something I had kept to myself for 12 years. Because the moment I told it, it would stop being a gift and start being a bargain. And I had never wanted it to be a bargain. I need to go back to the beginning to explain it properly. Back to when Marcus was still Marcus Webb, a first-year medical student from a working-class family in Canton, Ohio, with no money, a mountain of existing undergraduate debt, and a very limited path forward unless something changed. He didn't know it at the time, but something was about to change. I have to explain something about how I lived my life as a teacher. For 31 years, I saved a portion of every paycheck. Not a lot, $100 here, $200 there. I drove old cars. I ate at home. I didn't take vacations that cost money. I wore my shoes until the soles were thin. My colleagues thought I was eccentric. My daughter thought I was just frugal. Neither of them knew exactly what I was doing with the money I saved. Because I had never told anyone, when I was 29 years old and my wife was still alive, we made a decision together. We had seen too many brilliant people, students, neighbors, people from our own families give up on their dreams not because they lacked talent or drive, but because they lacked money. We decided that whatever we managed to accumulate over our lifetimes, some portion of it would go toward changing that equation for someone. After my wife passed, I kept the promise we had made, quietly, through a small family foundation I established with the help of an estate attorney. I funded scholarships. I never attached my name to them. The foundation was named the Linden Grove Education Fund, after the street where we had lived when we first got married. Over the years, the Linden Grove Education Fund helped 11 people, nursing students, law students, a young woman studying to be a veterinarian, a man in his 40s who had gone back to school for engineering. 11 people, most of whom never knew where the money came from or whose idea it originally was. Marcus Webb was number 7. Claire had mentioned, when they first started dating, that Marcus was struggling financially, that he was brilliant but worried about whether he could finish his degree without taking on a level of debt that would define the first 20 years of his career. She said it offhandedly, the way she mentioned things that worried her, but that she didn't want to make a big deal of. She wasn't asking me for anything. She was just talking to her father. But I listened. I always listened. I did some research. I looked into his background, his grades, his financial situation. I spoke with the foundation's attorney. And then I approved a grant through the Linden Grove Education Fund to a deserving medical student at his school, a grant that paid the remaining balance of Marcus Webb's tuition for his final 3 years of medical school, plus a stipend that covered his basic living expenses so he didn't have to work a second job. $280,000, give or take. He received a letter from the foundation explaining that he had been selected based on his academic record and financial need. The letter explained, as all our letters did, that the donor wished to remain anonymous and that no repayment or acknowledgement was expected. The only thing asked of recipients was that they carry the spirit of the gift forward in whatever way felt right to them. Marcus accepted the grant. He finished medical school. He became the surgeon he had always planned to become. And I never said a single word about it. Not to Claire. Not to anyone. I want to be clear about why. I did not give that money to Marcus because I wanted his gratitude. I gave it because Claire loved him, and because he was talented, and because I believed he would do good work in the world with the opportunity. I gave it the way I gave every gift through that foundation because the act of giving was the point, not the recognition. But I'm human, and the longer Marcus treated me the way he did, the longer the comments piled up. The longer I watched my daughter try to mediate between her husband and her father. The longer my grandchildren absorbed the message that Grandpa was somehow less than, the harder it became to sit quietly with what I knew. I still didn't say anything. Not when he called my visits intrusions. Not when he made the comment about my car. Not when he told Claire that maybe I should look into senior living options. I was 64 years old. Healthy. Living independently. And had said nothing to suggest otherwise. Not when he missed my grandson's birthday party and then told Claire that Grandpa's feelings don't have to be everybody's problem. I said nothing. Until Easter Sunday. If you enjoy real, emotional stories like this one, consider subscribing. There are a lot more on this channel. And this one is only getting started. Easter at their house had been a tradition for 6 years. Claire cooked. The kids hid eggs in the backyard. Marcus grilled. I brought wine and whatever dessert Claire asked for. And I sat at the table and watched my family exist, which is one of the great pleasures of being a grandfather. Even when the man at the head of the table thinks you're in the way. That Easter, something was different in Marcus's energy from the moment I arrived. He was tighter than usual, less willing to perform the pleasantries. I had learned to read him over the years, and I knew when he was in a mood and looking for somewhere to put it. I kept my head down. I helped Claire set the table. I played cards with the kids in the living room. I stayed out of his orbit. It didn't matter. We were halfway through dinner when Marcus started talking about a colleague at the hospital, a senior doctor who had been brought in to consult on a complex case. He was describing the man's qualifications. And then he mentioned, almost as an aside, that the doctor had been able to make a significant contribution because he actually understood how the real world worked, unlike some people who spent their whole careers in jobs that don't produce anything at her. The table went quiet for just a moment. Claire looked at her plate. My grandson, bless him, asked what producing something meant. Marcus smiled the way he smiled when he thought he was being charming and said, "It means making a real difference. Bud, not just," and then he looked at me. And his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. And he said it. Not just being deadweight. He said it lightly. Like it was a joke. Like the word was too small to matter. I looked at him for a long moment. My grandson was looking at me. My granddaughter was looking at her plate. Claire had gone very still. I put down my fork. And I made a decision. Not in anger. I want to be clear about that. Because what I'm about to describe was not a fit of rage or a moment of recklessness. I made a calm, considered decision that I had been approaching for 4 years and had simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive. "Marcus," I said, "I want to ask you something." He looked at me with that tolerant expression he used when he was humoring me. "Sure." "Harold, do you remember the Linden Grove Education Fund?" Something shifted in his face. Not recognition exactly, more like a door that had been sitting open for years, suddenly registering a draft. "Vaguely," he said. "Why you received a grant from that foundation in your 2nd year of medical school?" I said, "Tuition for your final 3 years and a living stipend. Roughly $280,000. He stared at me. "Yeah. What about it?" "I started that foundation," I said, "with my wife. Before she passed, I funded it for 30 years on a teacher's salary. I approved your grant personally, because my daughter told me you were worried about finishing your degree. I never said anything because I didn't want it to be transactional. I gave it because I believed you would do good work. And because Claire loved you." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. His face had gone through about 4 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. and I watched every single one of them. Disbelief. Confusion. The beginning of something that might have been shame. If shame was something he had ready access to. He started. I'm not telling you this for an apology. I said. I don't need one. I'm telling you because my grandson just heard you call his grandfather Deadweight. And I'd like him to have an accurate picture of the situation before he starts to believe it. The table was so quiet I could hear the kids breathing. Claire was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was a child. That particular combination of surprise and recognition that happens when someone you love does something you didn't know they had in them. Marcus put down his fork. He looked at the table. He did not look at me, or at Claire, or at the kids. He just looked at the table. I picked up my fork and finished my ham. Now, I wish I could tell you that what followed was a clean, cinematic resolution. That Marcus stood up, took responsibility for 4 years of condescension, and became a changed man over the course of a single Easter dinner. That's not what happened. Because people aren't movies, and real change doesn't work on a single dramatic timeline. What happened immediately was nothing. The meal finished in near silence. The kids, sensing something significant had passed between the adults, went outside without being asked. Marcus excused himself to check on something in the garage and didn't come back for 20 minutes. If you're finding this story meaningful, a like on the video really does help the channel bring more stories like this one to people who need them. While Marcus was in the garage, Claire sat down next to me at the cleared table and held my hand. "Daddy," she said. She hadn't called me that since she was a teenager. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something," I said. "And I didn't want Marcus to feel like he owed me something. I just wanted you both to have a good start." She was quiet for a long time. "He's going to feel terrible," she said. "That's between him and his conscience." I said, "I'm not interested in his guilt. I'm interested in what my grandson believes about who his grandfather is." She squeezed my hand. In the weeks that followed, the things shifted in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Both better and more complicated than I expected. Marcus did not come to me and deliver a grand apology speech. He's not that kind of man, he never has been. And expecting him to suddenly become that man would have been its own kind of fantasy. What he did was go quiet. Not cold. Not hostile, just genuinely, visibly quiet. I noticed that at the next family dinner, he did not make a single comment about me. Not sarcastic. Not dismissive. Not the usual low-grade belittlement I had learned to absorb. He sat at the table and he ate his food and he talked about his work and he was, for the first time in 4 years, simply present without being unkind. It wasn't warmth, but it was the absence of something that had become a constant. And the absence of it was its own form of relief. Claire told me, several weeks later, that she and Marcus had had a very long conversation. She didn't tell me everything that was said that was between the two of them, and I didn't ask. She said he had gone and found the original letter from the Linden Grove Education Fund, the one he'd received 12 years ago, and had read it 3 times. She said he had called his own mother to talk about it. His mother, it turned out, had known, not the identity of the donor, but the fact that the grant had arrived at exactly the right moment and had been what allowed Marcus to finish his degree without the crushing debt load he had been facing. She had prayed for whoever the donor was, she told him. Every year for 12 years. I learned this indirectly. Marcus mentioned it to me about 2 months after Easter. Not in a dramatic way, in the way that men like Marcus talk about difficult things, which is sideways and briefly and then quickly onto something else. He said, My mom told me she used to pray for the person who gave me that scholarship. Apparently she's been doing it for over a decade. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I thought you should know that it wasn't an apology." But I understood what it was. The thing about quiet generosity is that it only works as long as it stays quiet. The moment you reveal it, the moment you use it as evidence, as proof of your worth, as a counterargument in a dispute, it stops being purely a gift and becomes something more complicated. I had known that for 12 years. It was why I had waited so long. But there's something I had been less clear on. And that Easter forced me to see it. There's a difference between protecting the purity of a gift and allowing yourself to be erased. I had been so careful not to make my generosity transactional that I had swung too far in the other direction. I had been so determined not to use what I had done as leverage that I had left myself without any ground to stand on when the man I had helped decided I had nothing to offer. My worth was not contingent on what I had given. It never was. But my silence had allowed someone to build a story in which I was nothing, and my grandchildren were inside that story. Absorbing it. Starting to believe it. That was the thing I couldn't accept anymore. Not for my sake, but for theirs. My grandson asked me, a month after Easter, while we were fishing at the state park near my house, whether it was true that I had paid for his dad's school. He asked it simply, the way kids ask things without theater, just wanting to know, something like that. I said, "Why didn't you tell us?" He said, "Because gifts are most themselves when they're not about the person giving them." I said. He thought about this for a while. He's a thoughtful kid, takes after his mother that way. "But then why did you tell us at Easter?" he said. I watched my fishing line for a moment. "Because sometimes," I said, "the most important gift you can give someone is an accurate picture of the world." He nodded slowly. I'm not sure he understood it completely, but he'll understand it eventually. That's how it works with things that are true. They wait for you to grow into them. My relationship with Marcus is not what I would call warm, and I have made my peace with that. He is a good surgeon, and I believe he is a better husband than he was 2 years ago. And I know he loves my daughter. He treats me differently now, not with affection, but with a kind of careful respect that tells me he is thinking about things he hadn't thought about before. That will have to be enough. And it is. What matters to me, what has always mattered to me, is my daughter and my grandchildren. And for the first time in 4 years, when I sit at that table, I am simply a grandfather at dinner. Not a problem to be managed. Not a burden to be endured. Just a man who loves his family and wants to watch them exist. My grandson texted me last week. He's 11 years old. We just figured out how to text on the phone. They finally got him. The message said, "Grandpa, can we go fishing again this weekend?" I said yes. That's what I was holding on to all along. Not the money. Not the grant. Not the moment the table went silent and Marcus had no words left. Those things were real. And they mattered. But they weren't the point. The point was the fishing. The point was a kid who wanted to spend a Saturday morning with his grandfather. The point was the look on my daughter's face when she understood what I had been carrying quietly for 12 years. And she reached across the table and held my hand. I'm 64 years old. I drove the same car for 11 years. I wore my shoes until the soles were thin. I saved money on a teacher's salary for 3 decades, and I gave it away because a woman I loved believed that was the right thing to do with it. And she was right. She was always right. And every year that passes, I am more certain that she was the smartest person I ever knew. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be seen. I spent mine trying to make sure the people I loved had what they needed. I don't regret a single dollar of it. I don't regret 12 years of silence. I don't even regret the Easter table, although I understand it was harder on everyone than it needed to be. What I know is this deadweight doesn't pay for anything. Deadweight doesn't build foundations, or save paychecks, or approve grants in the middle of the night when the man his daughter loves needs one more chance to become who he was meant to be. I know who I am, and now, so does everyone at that table. All stories on this channel are original fiction inspired by real experiences shared by our community. Namis, location, and details are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental. What would you have done, kept the secret forever, or spoken up sooner? Tell us in the comments. We read every one.